would like to welcome everyone to the Farmland Legacy webinar series. It's going to be over 5 nights, 5 series this week, next week, and the end on the 23rd. Before we get started a little bit in the presentations, need to go over just a little bit of the housekeeping. Some of you that's participated in these, and this may answer some of the questions that's come up. This is a Zoom webinar, not necessarily a Zoom meeting. So the presenters and panelists will be the only ones that will have video and audio capabilities. That keeps us, basically helps control bandwidth, and it's also frees you up that you can do anything. We're not going to see the video from you as well. The one thing we would like to say is if you want to correspond, please put your questions in the Q&A. If you've got general comments that you want to make, put those in chats, but the Q&A will help us organize those questions, especially when we get some of the really invited speakers on that you may have some really serious questions for them later on. But try to put those questions in the Q&A. Regarding the printed manuals and the online manuals, the online manual is available now. If you want to find the resources for that, simply go to the Farmland Legacy website. I've got it listed there, or you can just search for Farmland Legacy and you can find the online manual there. The printed manuals, the initial shipments did not go out until last week. Depending on how they are delivered and how much time it takes, it may be a few days before they're delivered, but you should begin receiving those. Please keep us up to date with any of those. If you do not receive them, we'll make sure you get one, but the printed manuals just went out last week. From an email perspective, the Zoom links, David Bilderback sent those out earlier. You should receive the Zoom links for each webinar the day before the presentation. And it'll have not only the link, but it'll also have copies of the presentations or resources that they want to send out. Just a reminder, that Zoom link will be used the same link for all the sessions. So if you don't find it on one email, search the other and it'll be the same link. And the lowest password for all sessions will be farm, all lowercase. Everything's going to be the same. A lot of people have asked, and yes, the one thing that we are going to do is record every session. All the sessions will be recorded, and it'll take a little while to do the editing and get that information then put up on the web, but you'll receive a link with an email to the recordings. Hopefully for this one will be tomorrow. Those recordings will be available for 30 days to the participants. Hopefully it will last through the December's what our overall plan for that is. One of the things that we would like, and yeah, this is for families. We know there's multi-generations that are looking at it. You can share the link with the brother or the father or anyone within the family. We know we've got some multiple links there, or multiple folks wanting to view it. Just ask that you don't share that link, with everyone in your contact list or something like that. We want to keep those with the ones that you paid for that, but you can definitely share that with your immediate family. I've kind of got a promotion up there. Didn't introduce myself to start with, but I'm Kevin Ferguson. I'm one of the area farm management specialists with the UT Manage program. That's one thing that we have when we're fully staffed. We have 9 of those across the state. David Bilderback, who's on, and he's kind of our lead IT guy. He's been running the webinar programs now for us for over a year. He works with the Manage program. You'll hear, there's David giving you the high five. He's kind of probably keeping up with the basketball game tonight. You'll hear from Alan Galloway in a little while. Alan, he's one of the original area farm management specialists. He's been around since I started as well back in '86. We have him in Rutherford County here this week. He's also our tax coordinator or tax information coordinator. And you'll hear from him a little bit later. We've also got Tori Marshall on. She happens to be one of our newest area farm management specialists. Tori is over in West Tennessee, and we're glad that she joined us. We work with farmers on a one-on-one basis and in group basis doing farm management. To give you a little bit of update, the Farmland Legacy programs, it first came out what, 10, 12 years ago, we had kind of a promotion with it. We kind of went back and said, okay, let's bring this back to the forefront a little bit. We kind of updated that manual and now have it available. We also then have done quite a bit more in terms of planning for this session. We've invited some out-of-state speakers. I'm going to kind of go through this process of, why are we concerned about succession planning? Why are some families involved with it? First thing, and sometimes you'll hear multiple definitions for succession and transition planning, but when we think of farm succession planning, we think of it as it's a continuous process. It's not a one and done type of thing. We're going to talk about what it involves: transferring knowledge, management skills, labor, and control and ownership of those assets between generations, the older generation and the younger generation. You'll have other folks that may only be focused on estate planning, and we're going to talk about that a little bit too. Well, in terms of why is it important, and I think most of you all realize this, the age of the principal operator of our farms, not only in Tennessee, but in the US, keeps getting older and older. We see the trend over time that the number of farms owned by the older persons keep getting more and more. Over 75, it keeps growing. Even 65 to 74, it keeps growing. When we look at the Census of Ag, it's interesting that our younger farmers keep kind of steady, but where we tend to lose the ownership over time has been in the mid-age farm category. And one thing that we've seen for the last several years, the Census of Ag is conducted every 5 years. And every year, it seems that the average age of ownership for the primary producer increases by about 1 year. In 2012, it was 58 years old. In 2017, it was 59 years old. So a lot of folks look at this and say, oh, well, that's just the aging of society and everything else. We all know then that it causes some issues with the younger generation being able to get into farming. So that's the reason succession planning or transition planning, one of the reasons that we think it's very important. Another reason, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the American Farmland Trust, but I'm going to share some information that's put together from them. We used the same or similar data 10, 12 years ago when we looked at farm transition planning. But the one thing they note in a survey that the ownership of 40%, or an estimate rather, ownership of 40% of America's agricultural land will be in transition within the next 15 years. And that's because of the aging ownership of the primary producer, or the age of that primary producer, and then the fact that they will have to transition out and someone else will actually be either owning or making the management decision on that farm. Well, one of the other things that they have looked at, and I think it's very important to see what's going on in the state of Tennessee, and the other reason that some folks are very interested in farm succession planning or transition planning, how we can keep the farm in the family, is when we look at the amount of land that may be moving out of agriculture in Tennessee. The one thing the American Farmland Trust did, they identified what they considered the nationally significant agricultural land across the nation. This is the most productive ag land that we have in the nation. And they say this is the land we need to maintain to continue to feed the US population and help feed the world population. And in Tennessee, they identified nearly 4.5 million acres of that nationally significant ag land. Well, then they looked from, and this information hasn't been updated through 2016. And for this next slide, this is where development is threatening the agricultural land. And again, remember, this is updated through 2016. I would like for you to think about this as, what would this map look like? What would this map look like if it was updated from 2016 through now? And the one thing they do, in addition to identifying the nationally significant acres, they identify the better than average production acres. They call it the PVR index, something that looks at productivity, versatility, resiliency of the land. And that's the dark green that you see. But the red is the farmland that we lost from 2001 through 2016. And during that time, according to their information, we lost 277,000 acres of high PVR land in the state, of which 211,000 acres were those nationally significant acres. I will tell you that I was approached today by the Tennessee Department of Agriculture that said they want to place more emphasis on farmland legacy, farmland succession planning in the future. I know the folks with this group that the American Farmland Trust has shared some of this information with TDA. And the one thing when they combine this data together is the development threatens the development threat of agricultural land. If we look at the total from 2001 through 2016, Tennessee lost 659,000 acres of ag land that was either developed or compromised. And if we look at it, where are we losing that to? 22% was to the urban or highly developed or commercial industry, where 78% was low density residential or homes. So, and it's interesting how the Farmland Trust, and you can go to farmland.org or find this information at Farms Under Threat, but they take the information at how fast or the rate of which a state is losing farmland, and then they look at the policies that are in place that possibly help preserve that farmland, and they have ranked the most threatened states in the U.S. in terms of losing land to development, and Tennessee happens to be ranked the 4th highest. So it's another reason that a lot of people are interested in saving the land or transitioning that land over to the next generation. So in terms of farm succession planning, how are we doing? How do the folks in agriculture, how many of them participate in this, or are they being successful, or how many of them are interested in that? Well, if you've seen my presentation before, you know that I use this quite often. It's a quote from James Bennett, the Sunbelt Farmer Expo of the Year. He's from Red House, Virginia, and I've been using this for, my wife would say, several decades now. I firmly believe that adhering to tradition is the greatest obstacle to production agriculture. Well, and tradition can be a great obstacle to a lot of things, but a lot of times we ask people, why are you doing this now? Or why are you doing it this way? And you often hear, that's the way we've often done it, or that's the way we've always done it, or that's the way grandpa did it. So a lot of times tradition kind of plays an important part in production agriculture. Well, when we come to succession planning, you know, we have a really strong tradition and think about the things that we do around the farm and how proud we are of calling a farm the home place, or the 5th generation farm, or the century farm, 3 generations farming together. We have that really strong, proud tradition to doing that, but we do a really poor job of accomplishing it. One of the things I'll share with you, my good friend, Dr. Steve Isaac's going to be on next Thursday, or this coming Thursday. You probably see this picture again. That happens to be his father and son in East Tennessee. And I'll tell you how long that picture's been around. Ben just recently graduated from the University of Kentucky. But from the standpoint of how we have been doing, most of you have seen these some information like this, and I think I saw it in Alan's presentation. He's got some similar number. Approximately 68% or over 60% of adults in the U.S. do not have a will. Well, when we get down to particularly farm succession planning, and we can pull some national data and look at that and how many participants have done that, but I think something that we've done with Master Farm Manager in the past year and a half, we asked those folks in advance in a survey, how many of you have a farm transition or succession plan? And out of the 465 that completed that survey, only 16%, 75 participants indicated that they had a farm transition plan. Think about it this way. The 2017 Census of Ag, and we know things have gone up tremendously in value since then, but the 2017 Census of Ag in Tennessee, the value for land, buildings, machinery, and equipment, notice this didn't include all of your livestock, all of your crops you have in storage or anything like that, but the value of land, buildings, machinery, and equipment totaled $48.2 billion. We know it has increased tremendously since then. And if you think about that, I really think the folks that we had in Master Farm Manager were very representative cross-section of Tennessee agriculture. We had larger producers, we had smaller producers in terms of acreage, we had large row crop operations, we had small beginning farmers. But you think about it, if the statistics hold, roughly 16% of them, of somewhere around that 48.2 billion, had a plan for how those assets were going to be transferred. So historically, we've not done a really good job in transition planning. And the reason we're having these meetings like this, and hopefully have more across the state, is to encourage more people to begin the discussion, to talk about this. Well, again, when you see succession planning or transition planning, remember that it includes a lot of things. You may have, and I think Alan a little bit is going to talk about the tools for estate planning or tax planning. You may have some families that solely focus on estate planning and tax planning, how they can transfer the current assets, possibly into cash, to divide among the heirs. You also may have some of those folks that are looking at charitable estate donations, whether it be to a charity or a university or a school. But when we talk about transition planning or succession planning, it involves a lot more than just estate planning and tax planning. We're talking about who's going to transfer that management, or how is that management going to be transferred from the older generation to the younger generation. A lot of you have heard me say before, you know, the one thing we hear about why you want to raise your children in a rural setting and out on the farm is to teach them how to work, to teach them a great work ethic. But I will also ask, while you're teaching them to work, do you think about teaching them to manage? And should we also, during that time period, be teaching them how to manage that operation when and if they come back and it is transferred to them? But also succession planning is going to include retirement planning, business planning, the land use plan that's coming up. Some of the things, family goals, and there may be conflicting goals that we have to work through. Labor responsibilities, when the older generation is maybe slowing down and the younger generation is being more involved. An exit strategy, possibly, if something comes up unexpected that we need to make some changes. So that transition or succession planning involves a lot of things. And, you know, we a lot of times see the focus again on estate and tax planning, but we've got to bring in a lot more subjects to talk about succession or transition planning. The goals can vary from one family to the next, from one individual to the next. It may, and I've just listed some, and there may be others. Minimizing tax liability is often mentioned. I think Alan will touch on that. You know, distributing the assets by treating all the children or heirs fairly, and there is totally a difference between fairly and equally. It may be very difficult to treat everyone equally. Minimizing costs, planning for your illness, determine the future use of that land for long term. There's some of the things that can maybe limit that future use that you can look at in estate planning tools. Maintaining the quality of life of the current owner, and some of that may include how they're going to be taken care of health-wise. You know, is the current operation profitable, and can it remain profitable during and after succession? And I think my friend Dr. Steve Isaacs will touch on that next Thursday, this coming Thursday. And there also needs to be some kind of plan to transfer that management, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. The whole thing, it probably takes more than one person to be involved in that transition team. You know, to really do this in a complete fashion, the family needs to sit down and develop a plan. They may get advice from a number of different sources, and I've listed some, but there could be more out there. You know, it may take the information, of course, from an attorney, an accountant, a financial planner or lender may be involved. You may have an extension education person or educator and a business consultant, but all these folks kind of function as an advisory board where you can get information from them. I've had producers share with me that the attorney was the most helpful in terms of the transition. I've had others say that the accountant or financial planner was very important to them. The one thing you may need to do, and I've added down at the bottom, another member of this team may be a facilitator or a communication specialist to encourage the discussion between the family members. One of the things we often say, a lot of times you need to take this discussion off site. You don't want to have it at home where there's been other discussions, other things can lead in. I often share the example of I worked with a gentleman that was transitioning into the parents' farm. There were only two siblings involved, two brothers. One of them wanted to maintain the farming operation. The other was not interested at all. And they were having discussions. And I asked the gentleman that was wanting to maintain the farm, I said, when you all have these discussions about what you're going to do and how you're going to share, where do you have them? And he said, well, the brother comes in from about an hour and a half away. And he said, we go to the local church and sit down and have the discussion. And he said, what we've decided or what we've considered is that our emotions kind of stay in check when we're sitting at the church that we grew up in, and we can really have a productive discussion about how we're going to proceed with this transition. And I think that's a good example of thinking kind of outside the box in terms of trying to lead through this discussion. One of the things that we talk about early on is in this, you need to involve and prepare the whole family. And I make the note sometimes that to the younger generation, working here does not necessarily qualify you to be the manager. Sometimes some folks really encourage people to go off and work at another operation or another industry and then come back to the farm. The one thing we see over time is don't protect the next generation from the current business problems or successes. And that's summed up with, has the next generation seen the books? Does the younger generation know exactly what's going on in terms of finances with the current operation? And, you know, I'll be honest with you, I've worked with folks and found some folks that are middle-aged in the 50s and 60s that have never seen the books for the farming operation. So that's one of the things we really encourage, that the younger generation know what's going on financially with the operation. You know, and another thing is, in terms of the younger generation, you've got to realize also that this is a difficult subject for the older generation sometimes. So that's one thing to always bring up. I have the same thing that I mentioned earlier, treat siblings fairly, not necessarily equally. Equal may not be possible or desirable. Matter of fact, probably one of the only ways it can be treated equally is if all the assets are converted to cash and then they're divided up equally by how many heirs are involved. One of the things we always mention is, you know, don't neglect the spouses. And sometimes that may not be a priority for some. This is one thing we focus on in the Master Farm Manager section. Charlie Martinez, Dr. Martinez really covers this. Management is the key to success, and a lot of times transferring ownership is much easier than transferring management. I put in a note that management may have a low heritability coefficient. You don't learn to be a manager overnight. And that's the things that we see a lot of times. How can the younger generation be more involved? Can they, if there's labor involved, can they be responsible for paying the labor, or can they be responsible for going and talking about a lease with someone? But remember that management transfer is probably one of the more difficult things to do in terms of transition planning. A few things in closing, and I want Alan to have a little bit more time on this to cover all the tools that are available. And these are just some of the things that I tell people, or try to tell them to remember. You know, don't assume you've got time or feel well enough to complete your bucket list. Go ahead and do it, and involve the younger generation or your spouse, and make sure you complete that. Think about what knowledge has not been transferred to the younger generation. Dr. Dave Cole will be on later on. I think he closes our session on the 23rd. I've talked and worked with Dr. Cole a lot, and he talks about going through an exercise when you have a group of people and you draw a name out of the hat and say, they're no longer with us. What information does that person have that is really critical in continuing for this business or this operation to work? It's a very interesting exercise. And for the one thing, for the older generation, what we strongly encourage is don't leave the burden of making the decisions regarding the estate, the farm, all of the assets to the surviving spouse or the next generation. Go ahead and talk about it. Be open about the wishes, you know, talk to the spouse, parents, grandparents, everyone's involved, and go ahead and make those decisions instead of making it then such a hardship later on. And the one thing, there's no time like today to start. Even if you're a beginning farmer or a relatively new farmer, make plans now. And also, if you're an older, more experienced farm that's never talked about, today's a great day to start doing this. I'm going to close it out there, because this is just meant to be kind of an overview. And then we're going to let Alan Galloway come on and share his screen. As I said, Alan has been an area farm management specialist with the University of Tennessee since 1986. Alan's going to talk to you about different estate planning tools and how they may be useful and that you can look at for your operation. Alan?
Thank you, Kevin. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right this evening. I kind of want to mention a couple things. I know Ann McKinney is an attorney that'll be on in one of the later sessions, and I'm sure Ann is going to cover a lot more of the nitty-picky details related to estate issues, and I know she has a lot of good information. So I'm looking at my job tonight to try to share some of those basic information items that that will bring out. You all right, Kevin?
I was going to share with you, I've talked to Ms. McKinney.
Okay.
And she said the one thing, since you're going to be talking about a lot of the tools tonight, she may touch on them, but what she plans to do is present just her experience and practical tips in succession planning that she's encountered. That's what she said she really wanted to stress.
Well, good. Hopefully that'll fit well. So I'll try to introduce the folks tonight to a lot of the tools and documents that are involved in the estate planning process, and a little bit on the tax side of it too, that'll bring out some of those. So hopefully this will add to your knowledge base as well. That'll help you understand even more of what Ann gets into during her session. So rocking right along, let me see if I can get this thing working. Got to mention, this is all educational information. I'm not an attorney. I'm not giving legal advice. So I like to always clarify that on the front end. Legal is something you got to get from an attorney or somebody trained in that. So I'll let them worry about those sort of things. All right. So what is estate planning? What's involved in it? We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. What are the documents or the tools, as I refer to them, that may be needed to do estate planning? I'll talk a little bit about some advantages and pitfalls that you might run into trying to do estate planning, a little bit about how it works. What's the process involved? Who all's involved in it? And then I've got a good section on other important tools or items you need to think about when you're starting estate planning, and you don't necessarily want to be like this little guy in my cartoon that you don't necessarily want to spend it all, but that might be his thought process anyway. All right. Oop, went the wrong way. What is estate planning? Well, this is a very basic definition of it. It's basically just controlling what you've got while you're here, taking care of your loved ones and yourself should you become disabled, and upon your death, give what you have to whom you want, the way you want. And if possible, while doing all this, you can try to minimize any taxes, professional fees, and court costs or other complications. And that's what's needed to be done to do good estate planning. Well, why do it? I think Kevin's already touched on some of these. One, we do it to take care of our families. When you think about it, we spend most of our life raising our kids, building up our farm and our estates to what they are. And we should continue doing that even after we're gone if we do a good estate planning by helping take care of our family. Basically, you also give direction for asset distribution, your documents, your tools, whether it's a will or a trust or whatever it may be, and we'll talk more about those. Designate what goes to who. So who gets those assets? How are they distributed? And then, of course, as Kevin said, it can be critical to the continuation of that farm or your business if you've done a good estate planning to help put that on the right track to be able to continue. Another key part of it is reducing expenses on your heirs. If there's taxes involved or legal fees or other fees involved, doing good estate planning may significantly reduce the cost to your heirs. Yes, it may mean you have to spend a little money on the front end to do the planning, but it does help things in the long run. Many times these next two are for while you're still here. It may be good estate planning may provide you with some income tax benefits while you're still here. And I'll touch on a few of those this evening. And it also may provide situations where you can be protected or be better planned to take care of unexpected situations such as an illness or disability while you're still here to help you carry on or help the farm carry on if you're not able to actually do it yourself. And still, to me, one of the key things is by doing good estate planning, you're going to reduce stress on yourself because you know you've taken care of things, and stress on your family because they'll know it too, that mom or dad has done things to make it better for them in the long run. All right. Well, what is estate planning? Well, to me, it's a whole lot more than just a will. I always like to say a will is a good beginning, a good starting place, but it may take a lot of other documents to ensure that your wishes are carried out. And of course, the idea here is make that transition to that next generation or the transition of all those assets as smooth as possible to the next generation. And as many times as I've mentioned, estate planning also plans for non-death situations. There may be situations of illness or disability that are also part of estate planning to make sure that things are done as well as you would want them done. Well, my first major point is almost always seek out a qualified, good estate attorney, and as needed, a good accountant or financial planner. Now, I always emphasize qualified estate attorney because there are attorneys of all sorts and they specialize in a variety of things. We've all seen those TV ads every morning if we're trying to watch the news about somebody that's willing to take care of you if you have a truck wreck or a car wreck or some other legal issue like that. But that type of attorney may not be the type you want for estate planning. Attorneys tend to specialize. Now, they're not like doctors. You don't have an attorney doesn't stick out a sign that says that they have a specific specialty. But if you look at what they tend to do, they may, in their advertisements, they may list kind of what they emphasize as they typically work with. And generally, the ones that really spend a lot of time on estate work are typically a very small percentage of the overall attorneys that are out there. It may be only 5 or 10% of the ones in your community that really do really a lot of work on estate planning. So you need to seek out those because they know or are able to ask the questions to ensure that you get what you need from that attorney as far as the planning tools. And if you can find one that understands farming, that's even better and a little bit harder to do sometimes. That goes true with accountants and financial planners. If you can find one of those that grew up on a farm, that's even better for you as well. Well, where to start? Well, we do have a chapter in the book called Taking Stock, or looking at the inventory of what you have today. What is it that you own in a sense? And that may be the matter of sitting down and taking time to list out, or what are all the assets we have, land-wise, equipment-wise, animal-wise, and so on and so forth. And also don't forget the debt side of it. If you've still got loans out there, you need to know what those are. They need to be listed. When should those be paid off, or when do you expect them to be paid off? That sort of thing is good to have written down somewhere for yourself as well as everybody else that's involved should something happen to you. Life insurance policies, where are they? What are they? How much are they? Who's the insurance with? Where's that documentation stored? Is it in the lock box? Is it in the safe at the house? Where is it? Similarly, deeds and titles to assets. Where are those located? Somebody needs to know that. And most folks often say, well, oh, my spouse will know where that is. But what happens if something happens to both you and your spouse at the same time? Heaven forbid a car accident or the house burns down and you're both gone. Would anybody else in the family know where those items are? Things like investments, your IRA or your 401k, if you have that through work or through your own personal IRA, where's the documentation for those? Other investments, if you own stocks or bonds, where are those located? Somebody would need to put their hands on them and take care of those. And then what about some collectibles? What about grandmother's old famous dinner platter? It may be chipped and only means anything to you, but there may be somebody in the family that they really want that, or the mantle clock or something like that. And do you designate who gets those? And you can do that sort of thing, but somebody needs to write it down, and you may be the one that know who gets what. I recall a lady that put sticky notes on the back of all of the little items that she wanted to make sure somebody got. That works good for a while, but those sticky notes don't stay stuck too well. You may want to try something a little more permanent than that. And other things you can do is jot down the names and ages of all the heirs that you're going to leave things to, because that may be very helpful to whoever is the executor or the attorney dealing with your estate, just to simplify life for them as they're trying to get all those assets to who you wanted to give them to. Well, what may be included in this estate plan? I'm going to cover all these in a little bit more detail, but just to kind of highlight them here, a will is a great place to start. We'll talk about a power of attorney called a durable power of attorney for finances. We'll talk about advanced care plans. Those are also called medical directives, or the old term living will. That's all the same thing. We'll talk about what a healthcare agent is. We'll talk a little bit about trusts and how they work. They can be complex, but we'll touch on them a little bit. And then I'm going to mention some other tools and documents that I think might be of value to you as you're thinking about the estate planning side of this. Well, the will. Yes, you need one. Everybody ought to have one, but as Kevin already mentioned, over 60% of Americans don't have even a will. Now, if you had no assets, that's not a big deal, but most of us have something, and that's something we should have some say about who gets it when we're gone, and a will's the great place to start with that. Now, if you don't have a will and you pass away, you die. The legal term for that is you die intestate, meaning you don't have a will. Tennessee has what's called the Tennessee Code Annotated laws that specify who gets what if you die without a will. It tells what percentage would go to a spouse and what percentage would go to sons and daughters. And if neither of those exist, who gets, cousins, parents, grandparents, who gets what. There is a law that specifies that if you don't have a will. However, that may not be the way you would like to have done it had you written it in a will. So you may not care for that Tennessee law, and that's why it's best to have a will, so you get to say who gets what. Well, a will can be fairly simple. It can just cover the basics of divide my assets by my 3 children or whatever, and it can be as detailed as you need it to be. And as Kevin said, sometimes it's not a matter of just divvying things up equally. It may be specifics that need to be given to one heir versus another so that they have the opportunity then to continue that farm if they wish to. But the will allows you to give things the way you desire, not the way the state of Tennessee says. And that will clears up a lot of potential confusion. And as I say there, reduces stress on everybody. Well, what is the parts of a will? And I'll just touch on this lightly. There's a lot more to it. This is where a good attorney helps you out. In a will, you name who the executor, if it's a male, or executrix is, if it's a female, that will be in charge of making sure that those assets are distributed as the way the will is written. They're kind of in charge of the whole process. Now, in the state of Tennessee, they're also required to have an attorney involved if the executor or executrix is not an attorney. So that is kind of required just to make sure that the process is done proper and legal and all that sort of thing. A couple tidbits that's included in the will is you can require that executor to be bonded. In other words, should they make a mistake by being bonded, they would have to purchase the bond. It would be a part of the cost of the probating the estate. But that protects the estate in case the executor accidentally does something wrong or on purpose does something wrong. Hopefully that wouldn't happen, but it could. And then that bond would reimburse the estate if something like that should occur. Another thing that's often mentioned is there an inventory requirement? Does the will require the executor to inventory all your assets? Well, that could, in some estates, that could be a lengthy and expensive process to do a complete inventory. But if it's a fairly simple, straightforward estate, an inventory requirement is often waived so that the executor doesn't have to spend a lot of time and expense doing that and can just let, you might say, work with the heirs to divvy up the assets so that they're feel comfortable with the way they got distributed, and as well as follow what the will specified. The will can be as specific as you want. You can list assets in it of go to who, or you can say that there is a list of small assets, that's somewhere else that's not in part of the will of who gets those things. If you have a separate list, I always recommend make sure you keep it updated, especially if some of those assets are gone, or if one of the heirs, predeceases you, then you need to make changes to that list as well. Of course, the will lists who the beneficiaries are, who's getting those assets, who gets the land or the tractors or the livestock, or who inherits what, who gets the money, that sort of thing. In this, you could also name a guardian or trustee, which could be very important for younger people that have children that are still minors. Who's going to raise those children if you're not there to do it? Who's going to oversee the money that you're leaving to raise those children? And that's where a guardian or trustee could become very important. It could also be important in some cases if you have a spouse or family member that is disabled that someone will have to look after if you're not able to do it. So that's another situation there. And another part of a will most of us don't know anything about is called a residuary clause that kind of covers any other asset that might have forgotten to be listed anywhere. And it's just one of those little things that if you and I was writing a will, we wouldn't know that a clause is needed like that. And that's where a good attorney comes into play. Other things about a will is you can write a holographic or handwritten will. They can be legal in Tennessee. But I like to say, when do people do things like that? Well, if they're feeling really ill one night, or maybe they're going to have surgery the next day, they might sit down, well, if I don't, see the daylight of tomorrow, then, here's what I'd like to have to go to everybody. And that's better than absolutely nothing. Someone would have to testify that that is your handwriting. It has to be in your handwriting and signed by you, does not have to be witnessed, and it can be a legal will. But there have been complications in some estates when a holographic will was found, and that really maybe wasn't what the person that wrote it intended to happen 20 years later from the night they write it. So I always say it's kind of risky trying to do it yourself. It's better to use a good attorney. So if you do ever write a holographic will one day when you don't feel well, the next day when you're feeling better, go find that attorney to do it right for you to make sure you haven't messed up something. Talk a little bit about trust. Trust can be a very complex topic, but I want to touch on it a little bit because it's kind of important to have a general understanding of what they are. A trust is a legal entity. kind of like a entity, like a person, but that entity can actually own title to assets for the benefit of one or more people. So in other words, you create a trust by having it written by an attorney or whoever, and you are then the creator or the trustor or grantor of that trust. And in that trust, you appoint someone called a trustee to oversee that trust. It's kind of similar to the executor or executrix of the will, but when you pass away, that trust will then own those assets. So in other words, the trust would own your land, it would own your car, it would own your equipment. Anything that has a deed or title to it would be deeded or titled to that trust in many cases, or that trust could be created by a will as well, and it would say what happens in that trust. And of course, the people that receive the benefits of that trust are the beneficiaries. There are pros and cons to having a trust versus a will, and sometimes you need both, as I'll mention again in just a minute. As I mentioned, there's many types of trust. A testamentary trust is a trust that's created by the will. The will may say, create this trust to set aside funds for the raising of my children, should I be gone, and to set aside for their college or whatever. There can be living trusts. I'll talk more about them in just a minute because I have a little issue with them sometimes. There are revocable and irrevocable trusts. Obviously, a revocable trust is one that you create that you can change your mind about better and take later and take those assets out of that trust or redo it. An irrevocable trust, they're not used as commonly as they used to be, but that means once those assets are placed in that irrevocable trust, you can't change your mind later. That's the way they're going to have to be from here on. That was done more in years past when it was an issue with estate taxes, and we were trying to protect assets from having to pay estate taxes on. As I'll talk later, it's not as big a deal as it used to be. Trusts can transfer assets outside the estate. So in other words, that trust tells where those assets go without having to deal with probate or other issues. The trustee can oversee the transfer of that asset to whoever you designated that it goes to. Some cases that can be easier than dealing with it through a will, can be advantageous sometimes. There again, that's where the good attorney helps you decide. A simple trust may be there just to take care of the children, for raising them, for setting aside money for them, or it can be to protect certain specific assets. Maybe you own a piece of property or a condo at the beach, let's say, and it may be easier if it's in a trust to transfer it to whoever you want to, rather than having to probate your estate in Tennessee and at the beach, wherever that condo is. Might simplify that process a little. It's often used to keep businesses operating. Let's think about a dairy farm for the moment. If somebody passes away that owns that dairy and runs it every day, somebody's still got to have money to buy the feed for the cows, to keep the milk hands paid, that sort of thing. So having assets in a trust may allow that continuation easier than if that will has to be probated that might tie up some of the dollars. There's other ways to do it, but that's just one of many. A lot of times trusts are used by very large, big dollar folks to reduce their taxes, but most of us, as you'll find out, don't have a problem with estate taxes or inheritance taxes anymore. Do want to talk a little bit more about living trusts because there's sometimes an issue with them. Those living trusts are often promoted by people that are not local. You'll get a card in the mail inviting you down to the local steakhouse for a night to learn all about living trusts and how they can do all these wonderful things for you. And those folks are really good salespeople, but they may not know you. They may not understand farming, and sometimes they may just be trying to sell a product that may not be exactly what you need. That's why I lean back and say it many times. The good attorney helps you decide if a living trust may be a way to go. A living trust does not always prevent probate, and that's one of the things these folks tend to sell it as. Oh, if you have a living trust, you won't have to probate your estate. It might do that, but it requires that that living trust own all your assets. If there's one car title or one land deed that doesn't have the specific wording that puts that asset in the living trust, then somebody's still going to have to probate the estate to be able to transfer that asset to whoever it's supposed to go to. Living trusts are more expensive than a will typically, and can be they have to be maintained. So in other words, they have to be updated so that any new asset you purchase or any new equipment that's deeded or whatever, or titled, any car, whatever, is going to have to make sure that it's properly deeded or titled to go into that living trust. Otherwise, the trust can't do what it's supposed to do. And you should also make sure that you combine it with a will. Just in case you've got an asset that didn't get in that trust, that will needs to take care of that particular asset. Talk a little bit about powers of attorney. They can be a very important tool for you should you need one. And there's a good chance you might at some point in time. It's also called a durable power of attorney for finances. Why is it durable? That means it stays in effect even if you become disabled. What was called a standard power of attorney became ineffective if you were disabled. Well, typically, if you're disabled is when you need a power of attorney. Basically, a power of attorney enables an individual that you give that power to act for you, handling your finances. So that person could pay bills, could write checks, could deposit money, could withdraw money, could sell assets. They would have the same legal powers that you have with your dollars and cents and all the things that you own. So obviously, you pick somebody that you trust very much to be your power of attorney. You can name more than one person. Sometimes that's not a good idea. What if the two people you name to serve as co-powers of attorney don't agree on something? Typically, it's a little safer to name one person and a second person as a backup. Prime example, my brother and I were powers of attorney for my uncle when he was in a nursing home. If something happened to me, then my brother could step in and be the power of attorney. So we had a backup person. You can limit their authority. A best example I can think of there, let's say you're going on an extended 3-week trip out west somewhere where you're going to be traveling through all the states, and you need somebody to take care of things while you're gone, so they'll have the ability to pay the electric bill and other things like that and write checks for you while you're gone. You could have a specific time frame, a number of days or weeks that person has a power of attorney for you. You can limit it in other ways that they could only handle certain assets, but that gets a little too complicated. And usually attorneys are kind of reluctant to do that. Well, let's say you name somebody as a power of attorney and something happens to their abilities to serve. You can revoke that power of attorney if you need to. And another unique thing that a lot of folks don't know about power of attorneys is a power of attorney is only valid until you die. When you die, that's when your will or your trust takes over and says what happens to your assets. So that power of attorney that you gave that person, they have no power the moment you pass away, unless, of course, they also are the same person that's executor of your estate. That would be, they'd kind of continue in a different position at that time. All right, talk a little bit about advanced care plans, because this is critical for you while you're still here. It's also called an advanced care plan, a living will, and advanced directives or medical directives. It's all the same thing. In that you specify in that document what kind of health care you want for you if you're not able to say. So if you have a car wreck and you're in a coma, or you have a stroke and you're not able to talk or express to the doctors and the other family members what you want them to do, or maybe you have a terminal illness and you know you're not going to be around forever, what sort of care or level of care would you want? Should your heart stop beating, do you want to be resuscitated? And you can specify that sort of thing in that document that tells your family and your doctor what kind of level of care you want. Along with that, you can appoint what's called a health care agent. This used to be the same thing as a power of attorney for health care or a medical power of attorney, where you specify some individual to speak for you on just health care related issues. I always say here, you need somebody with a pretty good backbone. You need somebody that will stand up to the doctor and the family that's saying, oh no, help mom or dad stay alive as long as you can, do everything in the world to them. But that healthcare agent is there to say, hey, that's not what mom or dad told me. They told me if they're ever in this position, let them go, or this is the kind of care that they wanted in that sort of a situation. So you need somebody that may not be a family member in some cases that you want as a healthcare agent. But with this documentation, you specify what level of life support you would want. You're specifying it, not the doctor or family, and you're also not putting the burden on them to say whether or not you should be resuscitated. Because I can vouch for the fact that signing a DNR, a do not resuscitate order for a family member, is not something you want to ever have to do. And you don't want to put that burden on one of your children or other family members. If you put it in documentation, you've made the decision and you're not loading them with it. The other thing you can also do is you can specify whether or not you want to donate organs. You may have already done that on your driver's license or other way, but this is just another document that you can specify that on. Let's talk a little bit about estate taxes, because it's always been a concern for many folks, but it's not a concern for most of us currently. Currently, we don't have a state inheritance tax anymore. They did away with that back about 5 years ago, thank goodness. But the federal estate tax does still exist, but there's an exemption. So if your estate is not bigger than $11,700,000 this year, your estate will not owe any estate tax. That's a great thing. So that's great. With proper planning, that amount is doubled for a couple. So a husband and wife is now over $23 million that could be protected or prevented from having to pay estate taxes on. There again, requires a little bit of planning to make sure that's done properly. When the first spouse dies, the proper form has to be filed that extends anything that's left over from their part of the estate to the spouse. Not a big deal, just somebody, the executor or the attorney, has to make sure that that's done properly. Let's talk a little bit about probate. There's always a lot of concerns about probating an estate. Is that a big deal? In Tennessee, it's not that complicated. It means either the executor or the attorney involved has to go to the courthouse and open the probate. There's a fee for that. It's usually not that expensive. We're talking $300 to $500 in most counties across the state. It does require some other expenses. There has to be ads placed in the paper so that if anybody has any claims against your estate, they have the opportunity to respond. So it's not that big a deal to get it started. Usually the executor and the attorney oversee that probate process. Yes, somebody will have to pay the attorney out of the estate funds to do this work or do part of the work because that attorney's involved. Just to give you a ballpark number, the cost of that attorney could run anywhere from, and I'm just generalizing here, could be anywhere from maybe $1,500 to $5,000. Might be more if it's an extremely complex or lengthy estate process. Usually it's not more than that. Now you'll see some attorneys advertise cheaper for it, but they may not be including all those expenses that could be encountered. So that may be kind of their starting dollar cost, but it may go up from there. Typically, probate lasts about 9 to 12 months to get everything done as far as the filings, making sure the assets are distributed as you've wished, and then they have to file, somebody has to file a tax return for you for that last year you were alive and things like that. As I mentioned, large estates may be more complex, may cost more money to get probated and taken care of. The one problem some folks seem to have with probate is that information can be public. It's down, your will has to be filed at the courthouse as part of the probate process. But I don't know about you, but I don't know any estate that I've ever gone to the courthouse and looked up that I was that nosy about. So I don't think it's that big a deal to me that it's public information. Maybe it would be to some people. Other important items I just want to mention to highlight to you that could be important in this whole process of estate planning. How is your farm owned? Is it you, a sole proprietor, that you own it? Is it a partnership with you and your spouse, or you and your brother, or you and your cousin? Or do you have an LLC? How those documents of that partnership or LLC are written may impact how it's passed to the next generation and who owns what when you pass away. Another key thing is your land. How does the deed actually read? Is it you and your spouse listed on it? Is it you and a brother, you and a cousin? That changes how it's, and how that deed is written. Is it written with right of survivorship? So whoever's two listed on that deed with right of survivorship, when the first one passes, the second one gets that piece of property. But if it's written most any other way, or what's called tenants in common, and the attorneys can work with you on that, then your portion of it would pass. So if it's there again, you and your brother on that deed, then, and you each own half, then when you pass away, your heirs own your half and your brother still owns their half. And so that's, just depends on how that deed is written. IRAs, 401ks, and other retirement type accounts have the ability to designate who the beneficiaries are of those, and they would go to those individuals. Now, your executor might help with that process of making sure those get transferred properly, but those go outside of the estate. Those aren't part of the estate transfer necessarily. And the beneficiary or documentation of those IRAs or 401ks specify who gets it, whether it's your spouse or your kids or whoever, your grandkids even. Now, there are specific rules about how they have to handle those funds and what period of time they have to distribute that IRA to them. With most IRAs now, they have up to 10 years to take that money out of that IRA. So if it's a traditional IRA and that money is taxable and your son inherits that IRA and he's got 10 years to take that money out, then he'll pay tax on that money that he takes out over those 10 years. And if he waits at the end of the 10 years and takes it all in one big lump, and that bumps him into a higher tax bracket, he may actually end up, spending more money on taxes that way. So it takes a little extra planning on their part as far as that goes too. A Roth IRA, if you're familiar with those, aren't taxable when they come out. So that would be differently. There again, good accountant, good attorney helps you with the planning side of that. Life insurance almost always transfers outside of the estate. You have beneficiaries listed of it. They get those proceeds from that life insurance policy. And then another thing that we always like to mention is a last letter of instruction, or one of the other documents that I know Miss McKinney will talk about is a document she created called What My Family Should Know. And it's basically something where you write down of what you prefer would happen when you're gone. Who's in charge of the service, what kind of songs you like, what kind of flowers you like, what other things would you want your family to know if you're not here to say it anymore. And that can be very helpful to them because they'll know what you would want done because they want to do it the way you would have liked if you were still here, but they don't remember exactly what you told them. And so it's good to let them know with something in writing that they could put their hands on and take care of quickly. I want to talk a little bit about another tool that could be critical to some individuals, and that's called a conservation easement. It's got a lot of capabilities to do certain things. It's also sometimes referred to as a land trust. In other words, it protects that farmland or that land, maybe it's not a farmland, maybe forested land, that protects it from development. Basically, it's a change to the deed of the property that places it in this conservation easement. And it allows that property to only be used for 3 potential uses in the future, either farming, recreation, or wildlife. Now, it does a few things to that property. It lowers the value of that property, because think about it. If that nice piece of land out there that could have become a subdivision can now only be used for farming, recreational wildlife, that limits the number of people that might be interested in buying it in the future. So when your heirs inherit it, your son or daughter inherits it, they are inheriting something of less value because of that conservation easement, but it also protects that land into the future so it can't be developed. And it is, once it's put into that conservation easement, the term they use legally, it's into perpetuity. It's forever. About the only things that will easily knock land out of a conservation easement is eminent domain. Let's say that the government comes through and says, hey, we want to build a highway through that piece of property, or the county decides that would be a great place for a new school. They might be able to take it through eminent domain, and that would knock it out of the conservation easement. But that's, maybe what's the likelihood of that in most cases. One of the advantages of a conservation easement is it may provide you with some income tax savings. Basically, that's if done properly, that difference between what it could be worth and what it's worth once it's in the easement could be a charitable donation by placing it into that easement, in a sense, and you would get a tax break over a number of years potentially from doing that. So there are some advantages to you of beyond protecting the land by putting it into an easement. The 2 biggest organizations in Tennessee that's worked with conservation easements, one of them is the Tennessee Land Trust. According to their information, they've got about 131,000 acres already protected in the state over about a 70-county area. The other group that's primarily in East Tennessee, but they've got some easements and all across the state, is the Foothills Land Conservancy. They've got about 135,000 acres, but only in about 45 counties. They also work in some other states, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, a little bit as well. The one thing I do want to highlight to you is be careful of scam groups that are trying to sell these easements. You'll see them advertise about how you can get this great income tax savings, and if you'll invest $1 with us, you'll get $3 of tax savings. These folks are crooks. They're trying to get you to invest in it. They are illegal by the IRS's terms. And if you're involved in one of them, they'll go back after the company that sold it, and they'll go back after you as the person that invested in it. And not only would you have to lose the tax benefits that you thought you were getting, you might be involved with penalties and other things that would be involved from the income tax side. And you sure don't want to fall prey to that. So check with a good legitimate group like one of these that I've mentioned, and there are about 7 or 8 other groups in the state that are that work with conservation easements, and they can help you get started or know how to get started. Other planning tools I want to mention quickly as I'm winding on down here tonight is there are ways to do things like give to charities, to churches, to donations out of your state. A lot of folks will often say, well, I don't have a whole lot, and if I give it away to a church or a charity or a school that I went to, there won't be much left for the kids or the rest of the family. There may be things you can still consider. One of them is called a charitable remainder trust, where you may have a piece of property that really maybe nobody in the family is really interested in or cares about. Maybe it's 3 counties away. You could possibly put that into a charitable remainder trust by giving it to a charity. You would still get use of that land while you're still around. So if it's land you could lease out for crop farming or something like that, you would still receive that income. And then when you pass away, then whoever you gave it to gets that asset to then sell to generate dollars for whatever their charity is or their school or whatever that way. There are other ways to set those up. There again, good attorney helps you decide those sort of things. All right, other tools, disability insurance, you got to think about. Farming is still a dangerous occupation. What if you get disabled and are no longer able to work on the farm, but you're still alive, you're still around? Do you have insurance that might give you the funds to survive, or the family the ability to pay the bills and get by and still keep the farm if you're not able to farm it? Just a thought. Not usually, those are not super expensive. Other things I always feel good to mention is things like long-term care insurance. It has got tremendously more expensive the last few years, but if you went into a nursing home situation, depending upon your health now, you may want to look into that. There again, just something to consider. Burial prepayment insurance is a great tool because that's one less thing for the kids to worry about. Once you're gone, whoever's still here, if you've already paid through it through a funeral home or through an insurance company that provides those type policies, and all those costs are covered for your heirs, that's one less thing they have to deal with. Similar to that is having the gravesite already there. I often tell the story about a cemetery that's very close to where I live. There's 5 tombstones in there that have the brothers and their spouses all listed on them. They had the tombstones all bought, all put up, just identical. The only thing that their heirs will have to worry with was putting that last date on there when one of them passes away. Their kids don't have to worry about it. They don't have to think about spending too much money to put up a fancier stone. The parents have already taken care of it for them. Just one of those things that you can do to take a little bit more load off those you leave behind. Other tax issues I like to bring out. A lot of folks say, well, I want to start giving away some of my assets. How much can I give away each year? The IRS rules say you can give up to $15,000 a year tax-free with no reporting requirement. Now, let me specify, you can give away more than $15,000 to any individual, and there's still no taxes that have to be paid, but you have to file a form with your tax return specifying that you gave away this asset of more than $15,000. What it does change, that $11,700,000 exemption I talked about, it reduces it. So if you give away a $100,000 piece of land, that's $85,000 more than that $15,000. You would reduce that $7,700,000 by $85,000. So unless your estate's ever going to be over that $11,700,000, by current law. Now realize that 11,700,000 could be changed by Congress at some point in the future and lowered. They've talked about it, but they haven't done anything about it. Hopefully they won't, but they could. So, but currently it's not a big deal. There's no taxes due. It's just a reporting requirement if you give gifts above that 15,000. Estate taxes, I've already mentioned, not an issue for most of us. There's some people concerned about estate having income tax to pay, and that's only if there's income to the estate while it's being probated. You know, maybe there's some, you know, you had corn growing in the field, and before the estate can get probated to whose corn that is, the corn is sold, then that's income to the estate. There might be a small amount of income tax that the estate would have to pay. You try to avoid that with good planning because the income tax rates for estates are higher than they are for individuals. Life estate and property is often discussed. Hey, I'm going to go ahead and give the farm to my child, and I'm going to keep a life estate in it so I can continue living in the house and living on the farm until I'm gone. That is an option. There are pros and cons to that. One of them is if you give them a piece of land, they now own that land at the same value that you have in it. So if you bought that land 40 years ago for $500 an acre, and now it's worth $20,000 an acre, they have it at the $500 level if you give it to them. So if they turned around and sold it one day, they're going to have some capital gains tax to pay on it. Whereas if they inherit it through your will or through the trust, they typically get it at what's called stepped up basis, or stepped up to today's value. And that means then they would have no capital gains if they sold it then at today's value. Now, if they keep it for another 10 years themselves, it may go up more and they might have a little capital gains. But there are pros and cons to that. It does get it out of your, if you get it out of your ownership by giving the life estate, it may protect it should you ever go in a nursing home in some cases, but there's more rules to that I'll get to in just a second. And it also may, depending on the life estate transfer, you may still require some gift tax reporting as well. Talk a little bit about Medicaid or TennCare in Tennessee. If you give away an asset and then you go on TennCare because you run out of all the monies you had to take care of yourself, and that asset was given away within the last 5 years, TennCare could still go back after a portion of that value of that asset. There again, it's an optional thing if you think it's more likely, something you talk over with your family, where you transfer the assets now or later, that sort of thing. If that asset was sold or gifted below market value, then that also would factor into this. There's a fancy formula that they calculate on how much that TennCare value is worth and how much of an asset they could go back after. No near enough time tonight to get into a heavy discussion there. You may delay sometimes TennCare if you give away an asset in that 5-year period, and you have to tell all that when you try to go on TennCare, and if you don't, there's big penalties. But anyway, it might delay when your TennCare would start if there was cash or assets given away. There are exceptions to all this. That's just a lot of the rules about TennCare that I don't have time to get into tonight, but it's worth digging into a little bit more if you're concerned about that. So, wrapping up a few things here, distribution of assets. Kevin's already done a good job mentioning this. It's not easy to decide how to divvy up the assets of the estate, but fair is always the best concept to think about because there's typically 1 or 2 family members that have been more involved in the farm or have been more involved in your care or taking care of those things that you've got, and maybe sharing a bigger portion with them to help them on down the road may be the fairer way to do things. It's not always understood by everybody involved, but equal may not be possible. It may not just be feasible at all. So communication's already been mentioned. It is an important, critical ingredient to this whole process. If everybody's on the same page and you've discussed your wishes with all the family members, like Kevin mentioned earlier, even the spouses, the in-laws and the outlaws, as we say sometimes, everybody understands what your wishes are, then the likelihood of your wishes being carried out when you're gone is a whole lot greater. Secrets hurt, they don't help. It's not good if nobody knows what's in that will or what you've discussed with them. Getting their input when you're putting all this together could be of great value, because you may think one heir really wants this one tract of land when that may be the last one that they want. They want this other one. So, but if you don't discuss it with them ahead of time, who knows? So everybody on board, the stress is lower, the process goes smoother in the long run. So wrapping it up, my major points are you definitely need a good qualified estate attorney to help you line this up and direct the process. You want to make sure you communicate with your family as ways and getting their input and telling them what you'd like as well. And to sum it all up, you spent a lifetime caring for your family. Don't forget to finish the job. Just simply do it. And that'll wrap up my comments here. And if there's questions, I'll stop my sharing and we'll try to answer them tonight as best we can.
Oh, thanks, Alan. I think everyone can certainly understand why we have Alan in that position. I mentioned to someone, Alan's forgotten more about this topic than I know. But one thing, Alan, if you would, and I don't know, but go ahead if you have questions and put those in the Q&A. But would you kind of give an update on the importance of the valuation on timber if you have a change in ownership?
Thank you, Kevin. I'm glad you reminded me of that one because I usually like to mention, I forgot to throw that in. One of the other issues we often run into is if you have timber on your property, and this pertains to you selling the timber now, much less if you have it as part of your estate. It is critical anytime you inherit land or buy land that you establish a value for that timber separate from the value of the land. In other words, you've created what's called a basis or value in the timber. So that way, should you or your heirs decide to sell that timber somewhere down the road, that basis can be used to reduce the income from that timber sale and substantially reduce the capital gains tax that might be paid, or income tax in some cases, on the sale of that timber. And so that doesn't matter if you sell it or if your heirs sell it somewhere down the road. And it is possible that if you've bought land, say in the last few years or inherited it, you may want to go back and establish that. You could do it even if you've already sold some timber this year. Go back and establish a basis in that timber to save you on some tax dollars. It may require involving a forester to help calculate what's called or do what's called a back cruise and calculating what that timber was worth when you bought it or inherited it, so that you can use that value to reduce taxes. And I know Kevin tells an example of a gentleman that went through our master farm manager that saved quite a few $1,000s when they realized they could do that calculation to save some on their taxes of some timber that they had sold in the past year. But that could be very beneficial to some people in many cases.
All right, we've got one question in the Q&A, Alan. What if you have no family? What advice do you share as to how to proceed?
Well, that is an excellent and a tough question to answer, and that depends, I guess, on what your preferences are of what you would like to do with those assets. Do you have a charity or school or church you would like to see some of it to go to? Do you want to protect the land that you have to put it in a conservation easement so that it will always stay undeveloped land, you might say, for the benefit of others down the road? And so it comes a lot of times back to those personal preferences of what you would like to see done with some of those dollars that you've earned over the years and those sort of things. I worked with a gentleman many years ago that had no children. He only had a few nieces and nephews, and I think one sister left around. So trying to decide what to do with his things was a little bit complicated for him. But at the same time, he knew he wanted to donate them to a few causes, and anything that was left over then that went to family, that was well too. You may want to think as well about if you've got life insurance or IRAs and those sort of things, you can list charities as the beneficiaries of those, and those would go directly to those. So there again, I think a good attorney or maybe a good accountant could help you decide how best to divvy some of those things up. See, we've got another one. In my experience, it measurably helps when establishing your advisory board. Oh, that's a great suggestion, to designate one trusted member to quarterback the team and manage it for you. Do you advocate using an exit plan specialist to fill that role? It depends on your situation, on how many people you want involved and the costs of involving them in many cases. And there again, kind of a personal choice situation there. It is good to have a trusted either family member or executor that you know you can lean on to take care of some of those situations, makes things go a whole lot smoother. If that particular executor is not real experienced at the legal side of it, that's where they'll have to utilize that attorney to help them with that estate process, or helping, or if it's trust, helping know how to do that. Do you need multiple attorneys or advisors if you have assets in more than one state? Not necessarily. If you own maybe land in another state, or like that condo at the beach I was talking about, an attorney in Tennessee can still take care of probating that estate in another state, but it's just a matter of having to walk through that process of getting that asset, the deed that's on it in that other state. It may require a second probate fee in that other state. And it depends on what the laws of that particular state is. That's where a good attorney here can help you determine that. I do often recommend that you have a good financial advisor or CPA involved in this process, because attorneys are attorneys. They don't always know all the tax laws, and some of the decisions that are legal decisions may change your taxes now as well as for your heirs. So you may need to be involved that way. Let's see, another good question I see come up here on timber. Should timber be included when listing assets if you're nearing the end of probating a will? Isn't it specifically listed in the will of the deceased parent? It can be. Especially if you've created that value for that timber by establishing that basis. It doesn't hurt a thing to be sure that it's listed so that that heir knows what the ballpark value of that timber is, especially if you're trying to divvy things up fairly on a equitable or fair basis as far as value. Because if one heir is getting a piece of land that has no timber on it, it's obviously worth what the land is worth as far as that goes. But if there's land with timber, then obviously it could be worth substantially more, and that's a value that does vary. So if you had it valued or say cruised and calculated a number of years ago, it may have gone up substantially. And of course, timber prices do vary year to year. It's been up a little bit better this year than what it was, say, 2 years ago. So that value may have changed some over time as well. Doesn't hurt a thing to have as much information as possible available to that executor and to those heirs.
We've got one over in the chat.
Okay.
Is putting land into a conservation easement an expensive project?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that one. It is not free. It does cost some money, because to put land in a conservation easement, one, new paperwork, deeds have to be drawn up. A qualified appraiser has to look at that property and establish two values for that conservation easement land. They have to establish a value of what it is as current value, or what its best use value. So if it could be a subdivision, they would value it as what it could be worth as a subdivision versus what it's worth in that conservation easement that is only farmland or recreation or wildlife property. And the difference in those two values have to be documented carefully by a qualified appraiser. So that person's going to have to be paid to do that. Typically, whoever is assisting with putting this in the easement, or whoever's going to be watching over it, whatever group, like the Tennessee Land Trust or the Foothills Group or somebody else, they may require some dollars to help them oversee that property. In some cases, the land is actually donated to one of those entities, and then they may sell the land to somebody else, and that's how them generate dollars for them to keep doing the work that they do. So yeah, it is not a cheap process. It may cost quite a few $1,000s to actually put a piece of land into a conservation easement. There again, you have to balance that out against the tax savings you might receive by doing it, as well as the value of it being in the easement going into the future.
That's good. Any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat or Q&A now. I'd like to thank Alan for your presentation this evening. I will tell you one little story from a couple of weeks ago, and Alan, Tori, David, and myself will tell you that we run into very few people that like to keep or update records. There's very few people that will do that. And the thing about saying that this information is continuous, it's a continuing process. There's a lot of documents that Alan went through, and you'll hear about how to keep those more and later on. But 2 weeks ago, I think I was visiting a business, and there had been a death of an employee in that business, a COVID-related death. And we now know a lot of times in this society we're in, there's a lot of changes in marital status. And this employee had actually remarried during the time of their employment. And they had found, following the death, that the beneficiaries had not been changed on the retirement accounts and the life insurance from the previous spouse. So everything worked out in the long run, but it did cause some concern early on. So there is a reason to make sure you keep those documents all updated with a lot of things. Appreciate everyone logging on tonight. Is there any other questions? If not, we'll be back on Thursday night. You should hopefully receive an email tomorrow that will have the links. I will share, I don't think I did earlier, we're going to actually keep the registration open probably through the weekend. But since we do have recordings available, so if you know some friends or someone that you would like to recommend, they can still go and register online and they'll be able to view all the recordings through December. You've had looks like a question pop up in Q&A. Can you recommend a professional who can value timber back 20 years? You're muted there, Alan.
I'm sorry. I don't know of anyone that I would write off name, but I would check with some of your State Division of Forestry personnel possibly, or your local county agent may know somebody that that could help in your particular area. It is possible to do, but realize the further they have to go back in that calculation, the more complex it's going to be, the more it may cost you to pay that forester or whoever could do it to calculate it back that far. And you have to balance off, is it worth it to pay them versus the amount of tax dollars you'd save by having done so. So that's kind of the other factors you have to look at when doing that.
All right. Do you recommend an appraisal after someone dies?
Appraisal of the assets of the heirs.
I assume of the estate.
Of the estate. Well, to divvy things up accurately in some cases, you may need to do an appraisal of property.
Of the farmland, that's what.
Of the farmland, yeah. It may be required. It's also beneficial because somebody has to establish a value for that estate on the estate tax return. So when somebody's got to document what that estate is worth, to prove that it's under that 11,700,000, and you're not going to have to pay any taxes, but somebody has to place a valuation on that estate, whether it's the executor or the attorney or whoever. So they may end up having to do an appraisal in some cases to do an accurate valuation. Sometimes if there's been one done recently in recent years, they can update it fairly easily with less expense.